Sometimes I'll hear atheists say, well, if God existed, there would be a sort of consensus on this issue, but there's not. But of course, we disagree about all sorts of things, like whether we have a soul or what free will is and whether we have it, whether it's this is all just an illusion that we live in and so on. But that doesn't mean we can't have a rational belief about the external world or my free will or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a really easy explanation to explain disagreement, and it's just that we're humans.
Yeah.
And so then the question would be, would it be more likely for God to create this type of person or a different type of person that would be less susceptible to bias or whatever?
Huh.
So that's probably, I think, where the argument would go.
There was a time in my life where I'm ashamed to say that I hoped atheism was true. I mentioned this to you in passing last night.
That seems so crazy to me.
Yeah, it is crazy. And it's because I had a perverted view of God the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been listening to so many debates and so many talks by atheists, and I was reading them and just what they would say about, the reality of God. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it wasn't a conscious thing. I wasn't saying, oh my goodness, God is like that. It was just this sort of doubt that crept into the goodness of the Father. That's what it was like. It's kind of like if you knew your father existed, but you started to hear lies about him and then began to believe those lies, you might rather him be dead than in your house. It was kind of like that.
Or you hoped for that. Yeah, you hoped that he would just sort of go away.
Yeah.
Because you heard really bad stuff about him.
Yeah, so really, my solution was I had good people in my life. I got to read good spiritual books and obviously the scriptures teach me about the goodness of the Father, his tenderness towards us and things like this, and it really helped. Yeah, man. So when it comes to sort of, you said you read On Guard, which is an excellent book, I think. Was any of these arguments, did that help solidify your faith in God? Because it doesn't sound like you ever really had a crisis when it came to belief in God. You said it was regarding the historicity of Christ, maybe, but
it was the historicity of Christianity. Was there any really good historical basis for Christianity? That was just a period of doubt that I went through. But I have experienced doubts along the way. Like there was a time when I didn't really think that any of the arguments for God were any good, and I eventually got over that. And I think that was driven ultimately by emotional factors. And it was driven by this very irrational belief that if you can find a possible way out of an argument, then therefore you've got, or the argument isn't good, or you shouldn't believe it, And I think that's a lot of times what happens is we think, oh, well, I don't have to believe that Christianity is true, or I don't have to believe that this is a good argument because there's this possible way out. Maybe the universe is eternal, for the Kalam cosmological argument. And that's enough for some people to really get them to really doubt that an argument goes through. But on from like a rational standpoint, possibility is not the same thing as probability. Just because you have a possible way out doesn't mean that it's probable that the universe didn't exist. And so you've still sort of got to follow the evidence and decide what's most probable, not what's just possible. So I have gone through periods of doubt myself, and they don't last very long. Through this journey, they don't last very long. And I try to do my best to analyze what from the rational point of view, what is it that I'm really doubting?
Yes.
And what are all these connections that I'm making? Another thing that I've noticed about my own psychology is that I put a lot of emphasis on authorities figures. It's like this person I judge as really smart, really knowledgeable. And so if they have a good objection to my belief, I just sort of find myself putting a lot of weight on that. But that's not necessarily like a real good, solid argument that Christianity is false or that God doesn't exist. It's really just sort of an emotional thing that I'm leaning to just because I find them to be a reasonable person.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of missing steps between this person is like really reasonable, and that could even be, we could be skeptical about that because people can appear reasonable but can be driven by all sorts of emotion and bias and everything. But what I try to do is I try to analyze, why am I actually doubting? What is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I start to actually look at the reasons why, they usually are just not very good.
I agree. I do the same thing. When I experience doubt, it's more like a sea of feelings that make me feel a certain way, and that feeling is towards doubt and skepticism, and I'll stop. And I almost shake myself out. I'm like, okay, what is the argument?
Yeah, exactly.
What's the thing that I've heard recently, I've encountered? And I'll kind of think it out loud. I'm like, that's terrible. That's a terrible reason.
Yeah, or I'll just start to doubt one premise of one argument. and the doubt is not based on any reasonable anything. It's just like, oh, well, now I'm starting to experience doubt about this. Like, okay, why? What reason led to that? And it's usually from when I've tried to do an analysis on it, it's usually it's not based on anything but like a feeling.
C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters says, one way to tempt this Christian who's at church is to keep everything sort of vague. This vague sense that the people around me should be in togas and sandals, but never to have it be explicit that he thinks that, because then he would recognize it as ridiculous, but just this vague sense that things are a bit ridiculous. And it's sort of like that.
Yeah, I think so.
I think, too, we very often don't take into account the fact that if Christianity is true, we live in a world at war, and that the demons exist and Satan exists and wants our damnation. And so...
Well, I mean, that's another great C.S. Lewis quote. Is that one of the things... I think it's in the Screw Tape Letters. It's like one of the things... Well, I don't have the quote.
Oh, sure.
Off the top of my head. But it's basically one of the things that Satan was so brilliant about was convincing everyone that he didn't exist.
So that's my point. As we assess these things, if we've got Christianity and atheism, well, if Christianity is true, then there is a whole kind of invisible demonic realm that doesn't want us to come to belief in Christianity. And it's something we've got to wrestle with. It's not just like a neutral weighing of the premises. But then, of course, if you're an atheist, you say, well, that's just ridiculous. This is just kind of fear tactics to make you side with there. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're pointing out is that there's these sorts of leaps in reasoning that happens. We start to have these feelings of doubt, and then we leap to a conclusion that doesn't follow at all, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to sort of put an end to it. But on the flip side, to be charitable, I think that on the Christian side of things, when we're trying to build arguments for our own faith or whatever, I think sometimes we can just have a feeling that this is a good argument instead of having a real good solid reason for thinking that it goes through and that it's, it leads to God's existence and everything else. So I think that it happens on both sides. It's not just on the skeptical side of things. I think that.
Hey, if you enjoyed that clip, you will absolutely love the full interview, so click right there to enjoy the whole thing. Also, a big thanks to these groups who made that interview possible. Learn more in the show notes below about these guys. They're absolutely incredible and honored to have them as sponsors. Oh, and also, if you haven't subscribed yet, click subscribe and then that bell button. That way YouTube will be forced to let you know when we put out more content.